The mud at the bottom of Blue Mesa Reservoir has curled into plates the size of dinner tables. You can walk across them. People do. Tourists, snapping photos of what used to be 60 feet of water, now a cracked plane baking under the Gunnison sun. A boat ramp ends in dirt. A dock sits marooned, its pilings rising out of nothing. And somewhere under that dried skin lies the old riverbed. The Gunnison. Exposed for the first time in generations, like the reservoir peeled itself back to show you what was always underneath. This is Colorado. The place that feeds the West. Snowmelt State. Headwaters State. The stack of mountains where 4 major rivers are born, including the one that keeps 40 million people alive across 7 states and Mexico. And it's quietly, methodically, running short. Here's the first thing that should keep you up at night. Colorado doesn't have a drought problem the way most people picture drought. A bad year, a dry summer, then the rain comes and everybody forgets. What's happening here is different. Slower, meaner. The snow that should be piling up on the peaks each winter is arriving lighter, melting earlier, vanishing into thirsty soil before it ever reaches a reservoir. And the second thing, the part almost nobody in charge will say out loud, the entire water system this state built was designed around a river that no longer exists. The numbers on paper promise more water than the sky has delivered in over a century. That gap isn't a rumor, it's a debt. And the bill is coming due right now. Stand at the edge of Blue Mesa and the scale hits you. This is the largest body of water in Colorado. The biggest reservoir the state owns. In good years, it holds nearly 1 million acre-feet. In the summer of 2021, it dropped so low that federal managers made an emergency call. They released water out of it to prop up Lake Powell downstream, and the level fell so far the marinas closed. Boats came out of the water. Businesses that live or die on a full lake watched their whole season drain into the dirt. One marina operator described the shoreline backing away from him every single week, like the lake was walking off. That was 5 years ago. It never fully came back. So why does a reservoir in the Colorado mountains get drained to save a lake in Utah? Hold on to that question. It's one of the ugliest gears in this whole machine, and I'll show you exactly how it turns. Now drive west and south, into the valleys where the water actually gets used. Farmers here have been irrigating the same fields for generations. Hay, alfalfa, corn, that sweet Olathe corn people line up for. In a normal year, the ditches run full from spring clear through late summer. Lately, the calls come earlier and earlier. Cut back. Ration. Shut the headgate. In parts of the state, the senior water rights holders, the ones whose claims date back 100 years, are the only ones getting a full share, and even they're nervous. Junior rights holders, the newer farms, get told there's nothing left. You planted, you fertilized, you watched the sky, and the water just doesn't come. Think about what that does to a town. When a farm goes dry, it's not one family. It's the guy who sells the tractor parts, the diner where the crews eat lunch, the co-op, the trucking outfit, the school funded by property taxes on land that's suddenly worth less because it can't grow a thing. A dry field is a slow-motion layoff notice for a whole community, and it doesn't hit the evening news the way a wildfire does. There's no flame, just an empty ditch and a bank statement. And it climbs uphill into the cities, too. Denver, Aurora, Colorado Springs. Booming, growing, adding people faster than almost anywhere in the country. Every one of those new rooftops is a new tap. New lawns. New showers. New golf courses in a high desert that was never meant to be green. The Front Range pulls a huge share of its water straight across the Continental Divide, through tunnels bored into the mountains, siphoning snowmelt off the west side of the state to the east. That system worked beautifully when the snowpack was reliable. But when the mountains give less, everyone downstream of that promise starts fighting over a smaller pie. And there are millions more forks at the table than there were when the plumbing got designed. Here's the part that makes people squirm. Colorado is the source. If the taps run low here, at the very top of the watershed, then everything below, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, California. The farms of the Imperial Valley, the fountains of Las Vegas, the sprawl of Phoenix, all of it is drawing from a supply that's already shrinking at the well before it ever leaves the driveway. The Colorado River doesn't start rich and get poor. It starts here, thin, and gets stretched across 1,000 miles of demand until there's nothing left to reach the sea. For decades now, it hasn't reached the sea at all. The mighty river that carved the Grand Canyon dies in a dusty delta in Mexico, miles short of the ocean, in a bed of cracked mud that looks a whole lot like the floor of Blue Mesa. So how does a state built on snow and rivers end up staring at empty reservoirs and rationed farms? That's the question underneath everything you're about to hear. It isn't one bad winter. It isn't a villain you can point a finger at. It's a system, legal, physical, political, built on an assumption about water that turned out to be a fantasy, and a climate that's quietly rewriting the rules faster than any court or committee can keep up. The officials know. Read the technical reports and watch the language get careful. Hedged, buried in acronyms and probability curves. Publicly, the message stays calm, manageable, under control. But the raw numbers coming out of the Bureau of Reclamation and the state's own water plans tell a harder story. A resource overpromised generations ago, now physically incapable of keeping those promises. The cracked plates at Blue Mesa aren't the end of that story. They're the opening line. Because to understand how the water actually vanishes, where the snow goes, why the reservoirs won't refill, and why nobody with the power to fix it can afford to say the truth out loud, you've got to look at the machinery underneath the mud start with the snow. Everything else is just accounting. Colorado's water begins as powder up in the San Juans, the Sawatch, the Elk Range, flakes that pile up all winter and sit there like money in a frozen bank. That snowpack is the whole system. Not the rivers, not the reservoirs, the snow. Roughly 70% of the water in the Colorado River starts as melt coming off high peaks in a handful of counties. Get the snow, and you get the year. Miss it, and no dam on earth can conjure up the difference. Here's the part that should keep you up at night. The snow keeps showing up. Some years it stacks up near normal. And the rivers still come up short. Read that again. You can get a decent winter and still watch the runoff arrive thin, late, and disappointing. In 2021, Colorado's snowpack peaked at around 89% of average. Not a disaster on paper. The runoff into the river that spring? Roughly 30% of average. The snow was there. The water wasn't. So where did it go? Into the ground. Into the air. Into soil so parched from years of heat that it drank the meltwater before it ever reached a creek. Scientists call it soil moisture deficit, which sounds like a spreadsheet term until you realize what it means out in the dirt. The ground itself is thirsty, and it gets the first drink. Warmer air pulls moisture straight off the snowpack through sublimation, turning ice to vapor without it ever becoming liquid. Longer, hotter summers bake the land harder every year. So each spring the ground takes a bigger cut before a single farmer or city sees a drop. The mountains can hand you the same amount of snow they handed your grandfather, and you'll get less river out the bottom. That's not weather. That's a broken conversion rate. They gave it a name too. Aridification, not drought. Drought ends. Aridification is the climate resetting to a drier baseline and just staying there. A study out of the U.S. Geological Survey put hard numbers on it. For every degree Celsius the basin warms, the Colorado River loses somewhere between 9% and 13% of its flow. The Southwest has already warmed well past a degree. Run that math forward, and the river doesn't bounce back. It shrinks on a schedule. Now stack the reservoirs on top of that failing snow. Lake Powell, the giant behind Glen Canyon Dam, the buffer that's supposed to smooth out the bad years, sits down around a quarter full. In the 63 years since the country started filling it, the water has never once dropped to 3,490 feet. the elevation where the dam's 8 turbines stop spinning. The Bureau of Reclamation's own projections now put Powell crossing that line, going dark on its hydropower, possibly by the end of 2026. Not empty. Working, then not working. The dam keeps standing. It just quits doing its job. And that matters more than it sounds, because of the order things fail in. The West loses the power roughly 120 feet of water before it loses the water itself. That electricity, enough to run millions of homes, is also the lever managers pull to move and meter the river for the 40 million people downstream. Lose the turbines, and you've kicked the crutch out from under the whole operation while the patient's still walking. Blue Mesa, Colorado's biggest reservoir, is a smaller mirror of the same disease. Built on the Gunnison to store the state's own share, it's been drained again and again to prop up Powell downstream. An emergency transfer here, a release there, water pulled from a Colorado lake to buy time for an Arizona dam. Folks around Gunnison watch their marinas close, and their boat ramps dead end in dry gravel, while the reason got buried in press releases nobody read. The reservoir isn't failing because Colorado stopped catching snow. It's failing because it's being cannibalized to keep a bigger promise alive. Which brings us to the promise itself, the original sin under all of this. The Colorado River Compact, signed in 1922 in a Santa Fe conference room by 7 states carving up a river none of them fully understood. They needed a number to divide. So they measured a few years of flow and settled on about 16.5 million acre-feet as the river's annual gift, then split it between the upper basin and the lower basin and tossed a share to Mexico on top. They picked the wrong years. The early 1920s happened to be some of the wettest that century, a freak run of fat snowpacks. The men in that room built a 100-year legal system on a fluke. Tree ring studies done decades later showed the river's real long-term average runs closer to 13 or 14 million acre-feet, and in dry stretches far less than that. They divided a river that was never that big. Every drop allocated on paper past that point is water that doesn't exist. The whole basin has been running an overdraft since before the dams were even built, quietly borrowing against a balance that was fiction from the start. For decades the reservoirs hid it. Powell and Mead were so enormous they could swallow a bad year, a bad decade, and still hand out the full paper allotment. The savings account covered the overspending. That's over now. The account's nearly empty. The overdraft is coming due all at once. And there's no bigger reservoir behind these ones to bail them out. So picture what a Colorado farmer actually faces. He holds a water right, a legal claim, priority date and all, the kind of paper that's supposed to be bankable out here. He's got senior rights, maybe, going back generations. And it doesn't matter, because you can't divert what isn't in the ditch. A right to water is a right to nothing when the river runs below the number on the decree. The Hatch chili growers down in New Mexico got rationed to 4 inches of water in a season. Ranchers in western Colorado watch pasture they've hayed for 50 years turn to dust because the headgate opens onto a trickle. The law says the water is theirs. Physics disagrees. And still, the public language stays soft. Officials talk about challenging conditions and adaptive management and collaborative frameworks. They roll out drought contingency plans with reassuring names. Because here's the trap they're in. The moment someone in charge says out loud that the river is structurally, permanently short, that there's no drought to wait out, that the promises made in 1922 are physically impossible to keep, then the fight begins. Then the lawsuits fly, the states turn on each other, property values crater, and the whole careful arrangement that's held the West together for a century starts coming apart in public. So they don't say it. They manage the optics while the machinery grinds. And the numbers keep dropping, regardless of the tone. That's the collision waiting at the bottom of all this. The gap between what the paper promises and what the mountains can deliver. And that gap is about to stop being an abstraction and start emptying towns. Start with the shutoffs. Not the dramatic kind you'd see in a movie. The quiet kind. A letter arrives at a ranch outside Gunnison, telling a family their diversion right, the one their great-grandfather filed in 1904, is being curtailed for the season. No cameras, no press conference, just a form and a deadline. That's what mandatory cutbacks actually look like on the ground. Paperwork that decides whether a field gets planted. Colorado has something called a call system. Senior rights get their water first. Junior rights get cut when there isn't enough. It's been the law of the West since the mining camps. For 100 years, it mostly worked because there was usually enough to go around after the seniors drank. Now there isn't. And when the Colorado River Compact's obligations start pressing down, that requirement to send a set volume past Lee Ferry to the lower basin states, the curtailment stops being a local quarrel between neighbors and becomes a state-against-state reckoning that reaches all the way up into the high country. Think about what that means for a place like the Uncompahgre Valley. Peaches, onions, sweet corn, hay that feeds cattle across 3 states. Those farms run on water stored in reservoirs like Blue Mesa, and Blue Mesa is the same reservoir crews were already draining to prop up Lake Powell. You cannot send the water downstream and grow the crop with it. It's one bucket. Somebody loses. And the losing has a geography. It clusters. When the water leaves, the town doesn't announce it's dying. It just gets quieter. The implement dealer closes because nobody's buying tractors for fields they can't irrigate. The school loses enrollment because young families move to where the jobs are. The diner cuts its hours. Then it cuts its days. You've seen this pattern in the Ogallala country of the plains, in the San Joaquin Valley of California, in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, where the marinas on Elephant Butte sit stranded in dried mud after the reservoir fell to under 10%. A town built on water doesn't collapse. It evaporates, same as the reservoir it depended on. Here's the part that should make your stomach drop. Colorado is an upstream state. Upstream is supposed to be the safe place. You're at the top of the mountain. The snow falls on you first. The rivers start in your backyard. And yet the legal structure means Colorado can be forced to leave its own water in the river and watch it flow to Arizona and Nevada and California and Mexico while its own farms go dry. That's the compact's revenge. The document signed in 1922 in a hotel in Santa Fe by men who measured the river in a wet decade that never came back. That document has teeth, and the teeth are aimed upstream. So the interstate fight everyone's been avoiding, it's already started, just in the language of lawyers instead of headlines. The upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, keep insisting they never overused their share. That the lower basin has been living beyond its means for decades, pulling extra out of Lake Mead. The lower basin points at the shrinking flows and says the obligation is the obligation, wet year or dry. Both sides are right, which is exactly why there's no clean answer. The Bureau of Reclamation's own projections have Lake Powell crossing minimum power pool, the point where Glen Canyon Dam's turbines can't spin, potentially by the end of 2026. When the power stops before the water does, the tool used to manage the whole river for 40 million people goes dark, and the negotiations over what replaces the current operating rules, the ones expiring in 2026, have been described by people in the room as the tensest water talks in the history of the American West. Picture the endgame nobody wants to say out loud. A compact call. Colorado legally compelled to shut off water users who thought their rights were untouchable. Going backward through the priority dates, sacrificing the newer farms and towns to meet a number written before the Dust Bowl. Lawyers already have the briefs half drafted. The question isn't whether the machinery exists. It's whether anyone has the nerve to pull the lever, and what breaks in the state when they do. Now go back to that reservoir bed. The one from the start. The cracked plates of dried mud curling up at the edges. The old boat ramp ending in nothing but dust. The high water mark stained on the canyon wall like a ring around a drained bathtub. 30, 40, 100 feet above where the water actually sits. Stand there in the heat, and it feels like an ending. It looks like the aftermath of something already lost. It isn't. Not yet. That's the thing I need you to hold on to. That cracked bed isn't a tombstone. It's a warning carved into the ground, plain enough that a child could read it. Every foot of exposed shoreline is the river telling the truth that the press releases won't. That the old arrangement is finished. That the wet century is gone. That the math has to change, or the towns will. And the strange, stubborn hope buried in all of it is that this is still a choice. The snowpack still falls, just less of it. The rivers still run, just thinner and earlier. The reservoirs still hold water, just a fraction of what they were built for. None of that is zero. What Colorado faces isn't a natural death. It's a decision about who cuts, who pays, who gets honest, and how fast. Cities can tear out lawns and recycle water the way Las Vegas did, pulling its consumption down even as it grew. Farms can shift to crops that drink less, or fallow some ground in exchange for real money instead of watching it die for free. The states can rewrite the rules to fit the river that exists instead of the river a hotel room invented in 1922. Or they can keep managing the optics. Keep the reassuring names on the maps. Keep waiting for a drought to end that was never a drought at all. And let the shoreline keep climbing the canyon wall, foot by foot, letter by letter, town by quiet town. The water is still there. Less of it, but there. The mountains still deliver something every spring. The whole question, the only question that matters now, is whether the people who divided this river up will finally divide it by the truth instead of the paper. Walk out onto that cracked bed one more time. Kneel down. Put your hand flat against the dried mud, still warm from the sun. It's not the end of the water.